Hello, I'm Anthony. Cubase 14 has recently been released, and one of the nicest feature sets that we've just been given, this is brand new functionality to 14, is audio modulators. You'll find them in the lower zone. Here's the tab for them. They can also be expanded to operate in their own window, but I like using the lower zone for this stuff. Today I'm going to give you a demonstration of these 6 modulators. I've got a couple of very simple instrument tracks. It's worth bearing in mind modulators only operate on audio aware tracks, instrument tracks, sample tracks, anything that outputs audio, you're going to be fine. The first of the modulators that we're going to have a look at today is the LFO, or low frequency oscillator modulator. Now every track has its own set of modulators. You can have up to 8 of them per track. For the most part, they are constrained to that track, so they're really concentrated on helping you to generate that specific sound for that specific track. Let's have a quick preview of this simple loop that I've got running here. So we have this very simple Omnisphere sequence line and a couple of kit pieces. We're going to start off by doing some modulation to that Omnisphere sound. If you don't have any modulators at all, this is what you're going to see, the 6 icons. As soon as you create any modulator of any type, however, the view will change, and from this point onwards, this is what the modulators are going to look like. If I wanted to add a second modulator to this track, simple enough, or close it down again. So here's my LFO, low frequency oscillator. At the moment, it's not doing anything because it's not connected to anything. It doesn't have an output destination. Rather than run through all of the features in this modulator before actually connecting it to anything, I'm going to get it connected to Omnisphere straight away so that as I'm talking about this stuff, you'll hear these changes happening. So we're going to generate that output connection into Omnisphere. Now Omnisphere is a little bit unusual because by default, it doesn't have automation enabled on each one of its controls. Many VST plugins, such as those by Arturia or Native Instruments, usually do. But in the case of Omnisphere, I right-click on the control that I want to automate and I say Enable Host Automation. This filter cutoff control is now ready to be connected to Cubase. In order to attach modulators into pretty much any parameter you can conceivably imagine inside a plugin, the process is very straightforward indeed. You click this big plus button and you're given 2 options. Every modulator is inherently in Learn mode, which means if I single-click on this filter cutoff control, it's automatically mapped. It's as simple as that. The second way that we can go about it, let's get rid of that connection, is to explicitly select it. So instead, this time, I'm going to open the select drop-down. This plugin is called Omnipulse, and when I open its modulation destinations, here's filter cutoff that I've already configured for this plugin. Now I can start demonstrating what a low frequency oscillator does. As this green line goes up and down, a modulation amount from minimum to maximum is going to be routed into the filter cutoff in Omnisphere, and you'll actually see this cutoff value change in real time. Okay, so I've decided that that's running way too quickly. Let's slow it down. Here's my speed setting. I'll switch it to explicitly Hertz mode. Now, you might have just seen it basically just triggered then. The LFO snapped back to the beginning. That's because we have different trigger options to choose from, and at the moment it's synced to the project start. I actually want this low frequency oscillator to be completely free spinning, so I'm going to choose the free option. And now it'll never automatically snap back, regardless of what I'm doing in the project, whether I start or stop. The LFO is going to do its own thing as long as the project's playing. Can you see that that just stopped while I was talking to you? And now you can see that filter cutoff changing in real time. Now you can fine-tune the modulation range over which this individual modulator is going to work. I can have bipolar or unipolar mode. Can you see this arc around the knob change? I can change the zone around which the modulation is going to take effect. I can change the size of that zone by increasing the depth. I can make the depth negative. And I can output to multiple different destinations. My low frequency oscillator is my master control, and by clicking the plus button again, I can send it to a second destination. Let's use the resonance control right next to the cutoff. So I'll enable host automation, create myself a second modulation output, and simply click the resonance knob. Now I can specify a different range over which this modulation is going to take place. And you'll see both of those controls working in real time. And there they both are. At the top right hand corner of each of the modulation sections, you have this little white arrow labelled functions. If you drop that down, you'll see a range of different options. This is where you can save presets. You can specify default presets for each of the different modulation types. As you can see here, I've already created myself a default LFO, which means every time I create an LFO, I'm going to get it at a particular speed with a particular range of settings. But of course, you can also load presets. At the moment, I've only created my default and there it is. One of the other useful things that you can do, however, is to swap between the different modulators. So let's replace this low frequency oscillator with a shaper instead. The shaper is capable of operating something like a low frequency oscillator, but you have much more control over the shape of the modulator. Now by default it's creating a triangle here, but if I double click anywhere in this grid, you can see I can create complex multi-point modulation sources. I also have a set of presets down below, so let's choose the sweep preset. Now ultimately what I'm after here is to generate something akin to a filter envelope sweep on each one of those sequence pulses. Let's see how easy that is to do. So at the moment I need to get the speed synced up to Omnisphere. So I'm going to set it in sync mode. That's pretty good. And now I want to control the range over which it's going to operate. If you put it in unipolar mode, it's an easy way to basically halve the range over which it's working. That's pretty cool. Let's have a look at the other shaper mode now. We're going to use one shot instead. Now the deal with one shot is that we need to figure out some way to re-trigger this shaper multiple times. As things stand at the moment, if I get this sequence running again, you're only going to hear that shaper for a very brief amount of time. You see, the pulse was almost instantaneous, and then it's done, it's not going to trigger again. The primary value that one shot has is that you can use MIDI signals to trigger the shaper and have them accomplished periodically rather than constantly. Now, this sequence that we're using at the moment has notes that play over the length of one bar. So let's use these MIDI notes, these triggers, to fire that shaper at the beginning of each bar. Now I'm going to need to do a little bit of editing to do this, because you can only have MIDI notes trigger off MIDI tracks, and at the moment I've got this information stored on the instrument track itself. So here's an example of how to use MIDI to route into that modulator. I'm going to add a track of type MIDI, but my MIDI output, instead of going to Omnisphere and generating an audio signal, the sequence, I'm going to output to one of these sidechain destinations. The Omnipulse modulation number 1 is the shaper. So if I select that, any MIDI contained on this track is going to be routed into that modulator. Now at the moment this track is empty, so the easiest thing to do is for me to copy this MIDI part, and then they'll basically work hand in hand. Let's head back over to the modulators section and see what's going on over there. At the moment it's completely blank because I currently have the MIDI track selected. MIDI tracks are not audio tracks. They don't have modulators on them. The important track to look at is the Omnisphere track itself. And there's one final step I need to execute, which is to change the trigger mode of this modulator to MIDI instead. And now it's going to listen for a MIDI input signal. It could come from any number of MIDI tracks, not just one. So this isn't a one-to-one link between this MIDI track and this modulator. The modulator is listening to the entire project. Any MIDI that's routed into its input is going to make it trigger. So let's see what that sounds like so far. So you can see the pulses at the beginning of each of the bar. If I halve the speed of this shaper, change it to 1/2. Now the pulses are slower, they last twice as long, but you still get part of the bar where there's no modulation being applied at all. So MIDI inputs into modulators are really, really powerful. Don't be confused, however, they have nothing to do with the audio output of the plugin themselves. There is another modulator that deals with audio output. We'll worry about that in a moment, but the shaper is capable of being triggered off MIDI input incoming signals. Let's move on to modulator number 3. We'll get rid of this MIDI track, keep everything nice and simple. And this time we're going to replace the shaper with a step modulator. This input grid now allows me to specify step modulation values. These are positive and negative that I'm drawing in at the moment. Once again, we have no current destination, so it's not doing anything. Let's map it somewhere. Let's do something a little bit different. Let's map this modulator to the pan. So let's enable the pan automation. Click to add a modulator, click, and we'll get the sequence running again. And there we go, that's quite a nice pan effect. If you push pan too far, it can get a little bit intense. It's all just about controlling the range over which the pan is operating. And can you see that I've also got a bipolar polarity here, so that I have my pan control set in the middle and I'm basically just oscillating backwards and forwards. Let's bring in a second modulator. We'll map it to the cutoff as well. Before we make any other changes to the modulator, let's just hear that. Okay, too intense. Now that we've mapped to the filter cutoff as well, that's just too much. I want to calm that modulation down a little bit so that all of those peaks, the filter cutoff peaks, aren't quite so sharp. The easiest way to do that is to make these modulation values sloped rather than instantaneous. You can have them sloped on just the rising edge, just the falling edge, or both. I'm just going to bring this cutoff amount down as well. You can reverse the step modulation and you can move it forwards and backwards in time. On to modulator number 4. This time we're going to replace it with the mod scripter. The mod scripter uses JavaScript to generate its output, but don't worry, you don't have to learn JavaScript from scratch. If you go to load preset, you'll see this list of pre-built presets. Let's have a look at one of them. We'll go to the apply randomness function. And I'll use the select function this time because my plugin isn't currently open. I'll map it into the filter cutoff. Now what's currently happening here isn't possible to see without actually looking at the script itself. So if you open the script editor, here's the script that's generating that random modulation output. Now JavaScript looks very intimidating when you first see it, but it is actually relatively straightforward to figure out what the language is doing simply by reading these things. We're not going to go into that today, however. Let's just close the editor down and accept that basically this preset is generating a pseudo-random output. The control value that's currently being output is largely determined by these 3 controls at the bottom of the randomizer. If I disable smooth, turn smooth all the way down to 0, it's much easier to see exactly what the random value is that's being generated, and the smoothing function simply curves from one modulation amount to the next. Our depth control determines how big those modulation jumps are, and the time knob determines how often they jump. Now we're going to come back to the mod scripter in a little while, but before we do that, however, I want to introduce modulator number 5, which is the envelope follower. Remember earlier when we were talking about MIDI triggers in the context of the shaper, I said there is a way to generate modulation inputs from audio events. That's basically what the envelope follower is. So let's have one of those. Now, if the envelope follower is listening for an audio input, we need to give it one. Now, by default, it's going to listen to its own audio output. If I get this sequence playing, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. What you're seeing here is a representation, a control voltage representation of the sound that's being output by this plugin. Not the notes, the sound. It's much easier to demonstrate how envelope followers work if you have something with very sharp transients. So instead of it listening to itself, I'm going to make it listen to a different track instead. I'm going to make it listen to the snare track. For that, we use side chaining. At the top left of this modulator, we have the activate side chaining feature. Let's turn that on. And now we need to tell the envelope follower what it's going to listen to. It's going to listen to the snare. Now see what modulation input we have to the envelope follower. Every time there's a snare hit, we get a sharp spike in the control level. If I increase the gain, that spike will get bigger. If I change the release time, the speed at which that signal decays will change. So the release value is what happens after the envelope follower has heard something, but it doesn't hear anything anymore. Perhaps the easiest way to think about envelope followers is to equate them with compressors, because compressors also have an attack, a release, and a threshold. So hopefully these concepts are relatively familiar to you. But even just at the current settings, it's pretty easy to see what this envelope follower is doing. So I can now use that control voltage output to map into a modulation destination. To keep things straightforward, we'll stick with filter cutoff because it's really easy to hear what's going on with the filter cutoff. Let's see what this sounds like. There we go. So we've got those sharp LPF spikes every time the snare hits. Let's introduce a second track at this point. We'll bring in the Juno pad. It has no modulators currently assigned to it, but I want to use exactly the same envelope shapers that I've just used on the Omnisphere in the Juno. So I'm going to head down up to my functions drop down again. This time I'm going to ask it to copy the envelope follower settings. When I jump over to the Juno pad and open my envelope follower, I can paste all of those settings in. So that's configured the modulation controls themselves. Now I need to activate the sidechain to tell it to listen to the snare. The Juno is a different musical instrument. It has a different set of parameters, but it still does have a VCF frequency, and I can map to it at the click of a button. I've just realized actually we haven't heard this pad yet. I'm going to bypass this Juno modulator, click the bypass effect. So now this modulator is not going to do anything. Here's the pad on its own. And now I'll bring in the envelope follower. So for this sound, those pulses are way too quick. Increase the release, and the pad lasts longer. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Now it's time to introduce the second mod script module that I was talking about earlier. I'm going to add a second modulator, and it's going to be of mod scripter type. This time I'm going to choose a preset called the linear quantizer. What this basically does is takes a modulation input and quantizes it so that instead of getting a smooth signal, you're going to get a stepped signal. And I'm going to use the envelope follower as its input signal. There are two steps to accomplish that. The first thing is I'm going to set its own modulator input to 0. So intrinsically, it's not doing anything. Can you see those strobed lines? That's all to do with how many quantized steps the linear quantizer processes. So now I need to generate an input signal because I've turned its inherent input down to 0. Where's it going to get its signal from? Well, it's going to get it from the envelope follower. I'm going to generate a modulation output, and I'm going to select one of the modulators for this track. Modulator number 2 is the mod scripter, and it has a modulator input. We've not routed this module anywhere yet, but let's see the interaction between these two modulators. I need to increase the modulation depth so that we get more control signal coming in. And then decrease the number of quantized steps. So you can see the very close equivalence between these two modulators. Now that I have my stepped linear quantized signal, I'm going to route this into a different destination in the Juno that's playing the pads. I'm going to use the select function this time and go in via the menu. So here's my Juno pad. Here are the list of all of the activated automation destinations for the Juno. And then in the DCO section, I can modulate the pulse width. I'll mute the Omnisphere so that we can hear this a little bit more easily. Let's have a listen to that. And there's the pulse width modulation being applied in a stepwise manner. The final modulator is possibly the simplest of all of them because it simply bundles together different modulation sources all into one destination, and that is the macro knob. This is very straightforward indeed. We click the add connection and we learn a value, and then we learn another value, and let's learn a third value as well. And now all three of those modulation destinations have been mapped to one single control. And I'm in independent control of how much of each of those controls gets output. And that's it for the demo today. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit like if you did. Check out the Patreon and channel member links below if you'd like to help support my channel further. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.